So what's going on? I see, just because I don't answer your emails doesn't mean I'm not watching your chats. You're you're whinging and moaning about the fact that the basic acid sulfate soil podcast wasn't that basic after all.
Yeah, I just don't know. Do you think you met the brief, Gunnar? This is the basic series. Do you think you hit the mark there, or what?
I think I did.
I
What
think
was
I
it?
think maybe you're too advanced. You're too much of an expert in this. You can't be objective. I think it takes a
Did,
layman. If you're a layman like me, it was pretty full on, mate. I gotta say, I
did you
enjoyed it.
feel did you feel like I felt in the planning podcast?
I definitely wasn't falling asleep, but I definitely felt a bit out of my depth. It can get very technical very quickly, can't it? But I suppose that's the nature of acid sulfate soils.
It's funny you say that because it's one of those things when you start with acid sulfate soils and you read the guidance documents as long as they are, and but ultimately it seems this is fairly simple, and it is to a degree, and the more you start looking into this, it just gets deeper and deeper and more complicated. And I've tried to master this subject hard, and I have yeah, but it's a tough one. It is a really, really tough one. So when I thought
Yeah,
we're doing a basics on acid sulfate soil, uh, I thought it would be really, really helpful. I
yeah.
hope it wasn't aiming, it wasn't not basic enough. I hope it wasn't too complicated.
No, I think it
Uh,
just goes to show that yeah, you can get a false sense of security with acid sulfate soils. I think you can feel like you said, you can get into the basics and say, oh yeah, I think I know what I'm doing here, but you just got to be careful because there's a lot more to it. I think that meets the eye.
yes, there is. The good thing about most of the acid sulfate soil assessments, that at least I do, they are on such a small scale that really how much damage can you do? I mean,
Yeah,
this is already very controversial here, but if you read the guidance, they are certainly written for hectares and hectares of sugarcane farms, for example,
yeah.
like where you can most definitely do some damage.
Mm.
If you have an acid sulfate soil assessment here in Sydney in a coastal area and you are trying to get an underground car park for anything less than a waste field, it's swimming pool size kind of stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
if you, it's not that big a deal ultimately. But yeah, so maybe I missed the brief a little bit here. So
I'm just giving you a hard time, Gunnar. I think, like I said, it's hard to not get into the detail, and so I think that it's a nice introductory talk, and I'm sure we'll come back to this and get into other aspects of it soon.
oh, we can go deeper. Oh yes. I don't know if you noticed, but I had to slow down Laurie all the time,
Hmm.
he and I we can yeah, we can talk. Oh, but the bottom line of it is, here's a hint for everybody. If you're trying to get a hold of the subject, you just start listening to these kind of talks, and there's plenty of alga talks out that deal with that.
Yeah.
EINZ has a few of them. CRC Care has a very very good one. I mentioned that in the pod. Just listen to it, and at some stage, suddenly things start clicking, and then you suddenly say,
Yeah.
"Hey, hang on a second. So this makes sense now in combination with this." But it is certainly a deep subject
Mm.
that is for me a lot of fun to get into. But
Yeah, for
I've
sure.
tried to make it basic. So I hope everybody's
No,
having fun.
no, it's a good one, Gunnar. We should also just mention, actually, I've just remembered, we should say that this will be our last pod for the year.
It is. It is. We're taking a break. We're going to be back when are we back? At the beginning of
End
February,
of
right?
end of end of January, I think.
End of January. We have
Yeah,
we have one queued,
yeah.
and lots of new guests coming next year. It's all cool. It's the first year, and this has been an an awful lot of fun. We started in February. Was
Yep.
it February?
And we've done 23-ish, 23 episodes or so, I think, which is perfect because it's just about the same length as the Seinfeld season. 22 or 23 episodes. It works out perfectly.
Yeah, I didn't ask Laurie if it's okay if we call the episode the Ass Man.
Yes, man. Oh man, I definitely want to. Maybe the next acid sulfate pod needs to be that. I think this can be the basics.
Maybe.
The next one definitely needs to be the ass man. And any Seinfeld fans, you'll get that reference.
Yeah, yeah. When we get Lee Sullivan on, the author of the National Guidance, maybe
That will be a fitting tribute.
we need to warn him. Look, there we go. So everybody have a great time off. Have a listen to this and let us know if it was basic enough. If not, listen to it again. That's all I can say.
Good suggestion. Yeah, enjoy your holidays, everybody, and we'll be with you in the new year.
Okay, thanks, James. You have a good break as well. And everybody, here is Laurie. Hello, Laurie.
Hello, Gunnar. How are you?
I'm really well. Laurie, can I introduce you to Hammond? James Hammond.
Hey, Laurie.
G'day, mate. G'day, James. How are you?
Good, mate. Good.
You look younger every time I see you.
Well, that's a good compliment, Gunnar. Thanks very much. Must be the haircut.
Welcome.
I had a haircut this morning.
Looking fresh.
Quite a lot off, so maybe that's it.
You're one of these unfortunate people who are on my, if I get stuck, I call him list. Sorry about that again.
All right.
But I was wondering how I actually came across you. And I remember it was in 2021, you gave a CRC Care talk together with Lee Sullivan.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I remember listening to your part of that seminar where you are particularly the one where you talk about the difference between acid sulfate soils and acidic soils. And I must have watched that 4 or 5 times. I've taken notes. I went through the examples you gave. And then I was not understanding it. And then I started contacting you, and you were nice enough to very patiently talk to me.
Very happy to do it because it's not an easy thing to grasp hold on, and a lot of us aren't doing it often enough to really hone our skills, I suppose. That's why there's so much need for training and discussion. And I'm always happy to talk to anyone who wants to have feedback because, believe it or not, I don't get a lot.
And so, Laurie, what was the path that led you to becoming an expert in acid sulfate soils? How did you get there?
That's a good question. I'd never heard of them before. I started out my career in 1993, and the company that I went to work for, they got a really big job down at Shell Harbour.
Right.
And that just happened to be acid sulfate soils. And they in fact had a so-called expert. I mean, a guy who actually knew what it was about. He'd done them up in Queensland, and he kindly sort of took me under his wing, and he was a mentor to me. That job led me to a guy called Ian White, Professor Ian White. He also became a mentor of mine, and I just had a liking for it. I'd always had a soils background.
Yeah.
And it was just really unusual. It was different, and it was kind of the PFAS of its day.
Yeah.
At that time, it was really, the big thing. No one knew much about it. There was a lot of issues happening up and down the coast, causing huge issues actually up in North New South Wales and Queensland. And yeah, so it was something for me to get my teeth into, because I wasn't really at that stage doing much contaminated land.
Yeah. More
an engineering geologist rather than an environmental person.
It's interesting you say that they caused huge issues. It's one of those things that were in the 90s and early 2000s. There were so many fish kills that there's another fish kill, and everybody goes, I wonder what happened here. This is kind of weird. And now we look back at it, it's like, okay, we know exactly what happened here. Yeah. It's quite acid sulfate soils I find really tough. You start off rather simply and okay, I can okay, you run a couple of chromium suites or spocuses, and then you compare them to the action criteria, and off you go. This isn't too tough. And the more you look into this, the more difficult it all gets. And then to do another assessment, there's another curveball. And I'm on the phone to you yet again. It's like, this is ridiculous. Right? I'm like, when will I bloody master this one here? For today, Laurie, I know you are one of the utmost experts in Australia on this very subject. The podcast will be called The Basics Acid Sulfate Soil.
Yeah.
So we need to stick to the basics. Really the basics. So run-of-the-mill coastal acid sulfate soils. Can we just limit ourselves to the coastal acid sulfate soils?
Sure.
I'm the layman today, Laurie, because I really don't know much about acid sulfate soils at all. So I'm probably going to ask all the silly questions.
That's fine. There's no, I can tell you why it's so complicated now. It's because it's all been bolted on as we've learned more and more.
Right.
And it's a problem that we may have with PFAS as well. As we learn more, we're going to bolt more onto it. We're going to say, oh, we're going to do this now. Now we've got to do this. Well, we found this, so we better do this. And that's why we're in the position we are in with acid sulfate soils, because we haven't done a lot lately, but up until 2010, 2012, we were doing an enormous amount of research. And they're finding things that hang on, we didn't know about that.
We bumped into each other at the Acid Sulfate Soil Conference in Adelaide 2 years ago or whatever it was. But when you listen to world-class researchers, they envy Australia for the quality of guideline documents we have and for the quality of laboratory analyses we have. When I take a sample and I send it to the lab, this is stock standard stuff. There's plenty of labs in Sydney or in anywhere to do that. That is not the case overseas. They are struggling to get analysis done. They envy Australia. Especially the 2018 national guidance is the envy of the world when it comes to guidance for acid sulfate soils. You are part of that. You've contributed to it all. So tell us, in layman terms, coastal acid sulfate soils, what are they?
So really, 11,000 years ago, the sea levels were a lot lower than they were now. But then we're in the middle of an ice age. So as the ice melted, the sea levels started to rise, and this happened all around the world and in Australia as well. They rose for thousands of years. They believe that they stabilised somewhere around 7,000 years ago. As they grew or as they increased, they continually put sediment onto the shore. So sediment was coming from the ocean onto the shore, and they rose up until the level of the high tide, which is around about 2 meters above sea level. Okay, and there is some conjecture that maybe it went a little bit higher than that. So between that tidal range, 2 meters above sea level and zero, there's a lot of sediment being deposited, and a lot of that sediment has sulfur in it. Over time, that's mixed with a lot of the sediment, which has iron in it, and a lot of the sulfates from the seawater. And then you get bacteria as well. That has produced a thing called pyrite, and it's a sulfide, which means that in all of these sediments, all around the coastal fringe of Australia, at least 2 meters above sea level, you have sediments that have pyrite in them. And as the sea level has fluctuated and as we've drained a lot of the coastal areas, that pyrite has oxidized. We wanted to drain a lot of the coastal areas so that we could turn it into agricultural land. That was a big thing. And that happened a lot up on the northern New South Wales and into Queensland for sugarcane. So they lowered the water table considerably by a few metres. That exposed the soils that had pyrite in them, and they started to oxidize. And they oxidized to a point where they started to produce sulfuric acid. And what they realized then, these soils were sitting there with a stored amount of acidity all through them. And when a flood came, which was very regular on the northern New South Wales coast and in Queensland, the water would saturate these sediments that had oxidized and had a stored amount of acidity in them. And then it would drain out. And as the flood levels receded, all of that water would flush out, and it would flush out with acid. A normal pH in seawater is 8. A normal pH in the freshwater in the streams was about 6 or 7. These ones dropped the pH to around about 2. As they flushed out into the rivers, the fish that were in the rivers couldn't escape. They got caught up in the low pH, and that's what killed them, because along with the low pH, it can also strip oxygen out of the water column. So that led to these enormous fish kills that happened up on the north coast in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. There were huge fish kills.
in these flood events, you suddenly flush rivers with low pH fresh water. One of the problems is then the low pH comes hand in hand with low oxygen. Is that what you say?
Yeah.
When you drop the pH, heavy metals get mobilized in the soil. And particularly aluminium gets then flushed out. And aluminium, I hear, is really nasty to fish gills. It attaches to the gills and stops them from working. Am I on the right track here?
That's right. Yeah, I do.
All right. So that answers my second question. Why do we have to worry? I mean, other than the fish kills, I mean, it goes on and on and on in the guidance. Everybody, just first 3 pages in the guidance, it will tell you what else can happen when you...
That's right. They're particularly nasty soils, Gunnar. It is this metal. Certainly aluminium is stripped out, but a big issue is arsenic. Arsenic is prevalent in all of these sediments, and it's a much larger issue overseas. All of the Mekong Delta, a lot of the deltas in India, Bangladesh are all formed the same way. All water is used for drinking, so they take a lot of the water out and they lower the water table considerably, and that has created a lot of arsenic. And there are enormous health issues for people that are living in those areas who are reliant on bore water in an acid sulfate soil environment.
So we have soils that are rather harmless if you don't disturb them.
Yep.
You manage to get oxygen to them, and they turn really nasty.
Yep.
By releasing sulfuric acid and everything that goes with it, with the low pHs and mobilization of heavy metals. For example, right, you would expose acid sulfate soils quite easily when you start excavating for swimming pools, when you start excavating for underground car parks. Any kind of excavation will bring completely harmless soils in contact with oxygen and cause all sorts of hazards. 2 types of acid sulfate soils, potential and actual. Give us a quick rundown, please.
Actual acid sulfate soils, definition was that they were sitting above the water table. So therefore they'd had oxygen, got into the soils, and they'd actually produced acid. So the pH was low. It's generally pH cutoff is about 4. Now, potential acid sulfate soils are generally, obviously, they've got potential to become acidic, but they generally sit below the water table, so they haven't been exposed to air, and their pH can be around about 6, maybe sometimes 7, but they have the potential to acidify and drop the pH to below 4.
Okay. So both of them are called acid sulfate soils. One of them has already undergone at least partial oxidization. They are already very acidic. The others, the potential acid sulfate soil, like the name says, they only have the potential to cause havoc, but they're sitting there in the subsurface quite nicely until we get there and give them oxygen.
Yep.
I had a question about the maps that we use, Laurie. There's a couple of different sources of acid sulfate soil risk mapping that I've come across. There's the local environment plan mapping, and then there's kind of eSpade. So there's like a Office of Environment or ex-Office of Environment data set. First of all, can you explain what those data sets are? And then also, can you just comment on, I guess, how much weight should be put on the classes of acid sulfate soils or the risk levels in those, and whether that's all we should be considering, or if there are other factors we should look at as to whether acid sulfate soil is likely to occur?
Yep. Once again, it's all in the dim dark past. In the mid-90s, the New South Wales government decided that they needed a tool to be able to help councils in assessing acid sulfate soils, so they commissioned their own people to go out and do mapping. They used a system whereby it was all around 1 metre above sea level. That was how they determined the classes and the risk categories.
Right. 1
metre above sea level is an average. So they use that as their cutoff point. And anything above that or below that, up to about 4 metres above sea level, they put it into a risk category.
Yep.
Right? And it was pretty good. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
I think they're really good, actually. They went for a while and then everything went digitised. And so all they've done now, eSpade is just a digitised version of those original maps. But they have changed the categories somewhat. And that's come about because of some work from the CSIRO. They're still very, very valuable maps. I just think they're probably 90% on the money. So if you're in a red zone, you should be getting acid sulfate soils. The council ones were done by, as far as I know, they were done internally by the council.
Right.
And they sometimes don't match up. They're not as accurate, and you've got to look at other factors. If you're relying just on those council ones, you do have to look at other factors. You do need to know what height above sea level you are. You've got to look at geology as well. They aren't as accurate, and there are those variabilities that can come along because we're testing way too many class 5 acid sulfate soils or what we think are acid sulfate soils.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Super helpful. So it sounds like they, even though they're used for planning, planning controls, it sounds like the other set of maps, the risk-based maps, are the more effective ones.
I generally go to them first.
Yeah,
I'll go and see what the council have come up with.
Yeah.
The thing with the council is it's just for planning purposes.
Yeah.
They're not designed by a scientist or a soil scientist. They're for planning.
So the maps are one of the first steps you do do I need to do an acid sulfate soil assessment, or you are asked to do an acid sulfate soil assessment. So you consult the maps, and then there's various steps in the guidelines that you need to take. Let's talk about the guidelines. So what guidance do we have in New South Wales? Okay, again, basic. I mean, you and I could talk about this now for another hour.
Okay, let's keep it basic. All right. So in New South Wales, we have the 1998 guidelines, which were instigated by a technical committee called ASMAC. And at the time, they were the ants pants. So they were the number one guidelines within Australia. So New South Wales is still bound up into that. It's bound up in the planning guidelines. And so they are virtually the ones we were supposed to follow in New South Wales. They are not really superseded by the national guidelines. So the national guidelines are the benchmark and best practice, but we can refer to them, but we have to be guided by the 1998 guidelines. So whenever we're doing an assessment, you have to be sure that you include them as what you are doing the assessment under. Does that answer that question?
Yes. I need to add to that.
Yeah.
The ASMAC, so the 1998 guidelines, are entrenched in the LEPs. And as a result, they form part of the law. When a council says you need to perform an acid sulfate soil assessment, you look at council's LEP, it's hardwired are the 1998 ASMAC guidelines in there.
Yes. Yeah.
And although the New South Wales EPA says, and I quote here on their website, they say the national guidance, which is the 2018 guidance, supplements but does not replace the 1998 guidance. My immediate response to that is, what the hell is that supposed to mean? Guys, it doesn't replace, but it supplements it. And I wouldn't have a problem with it all. But the difference between the 1998 and the 2018 is everything else but trivial. There is some fundamental differences in those and in how you interpret net acidity. We're going to keep it basic, but ultimately, and this is something I need to stress, if council asks you to do an assessment and you do not use the methods in the 1998 guidance, which is the law in the LEP, you are actually breaking the law. This is this crazy situation that we are in. We have fantastic guidelines. They are called the National Guidance 2018. The world envies us for those.
Is there any plans to update the New South Wales guidance to align with the New South Wales guidance? Like, what's the situation there?
Oh, the innocent bystander. Keep going.
There are no plans in place. There's certainly some lobbying going on in the background.
Yeah.
Probably not real good lobbying because I'm doing it. But there's a certain feeling that we don't need to do that. But I think, as pointed out, we do. There's a fundamental reason we need to do it. And Gunnar's really hit it on the head. Yes, there is. The last talk I had with the EPA, we're sitting around talking about a few things, and I said that, we really need to update them. And he, and there's nothing against the EPA for this. He said, well, I don't know I'll have to investigate because I don't know who's in charge. I don't know who's controlling. And that's a fair comment because they're now it's an orphan document. There is no one looking after it because it was under the Planning Act and there's no one left from ASMAC. The EPA it's just been foisted onto the EPA that they don't look after it. No one in there is looking after it. So that's one of the problems we've got. Who do we go to? Say, yeah, okay, I will do it. Because I'll just quickly say what happened in Queensland. They have someone who's responsible for it. Sue Ellen Deere is the author. She's responsible for those guidelines. And the reason they updated them was simply because some consultants went to her and said, look, we think that you should align our guidelines, Queensland guidelines, with the national guidelines. And so they did.
Sue Ellen does an unbelievable job.
Oh, they're fantastic. Right?
And if you think that the 2018 national guidance is world leading, you need to read those guidelines. She is on revision 5, so she has 5 times improved on them. And every meeting with her is an eye opener. She's fantastic. I will get her on here to talk about this.
Sure, they are better than the national guidelines because they cover so much of the management of these things. But look, going back to New South Wales, the problem we have is who do you go and see? Who do you talk to? We've got to get some organisations on board to actually lobby the New South Wales government. By all organisations, I'm talking Soil Science Australia, ALGA, maybe people like that, to get people, get them on board to say, look, the industry has recognised this is a problem. You have to do something about it.
Okay, so let's go back to the basics. We have drifted off into a fringe expertise corner that anybody who knows a lot about acid sulfate soils like you do, this is something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
Guys, we're running around with 1998 guidelines 26 years ago. A lot has happened. It's crazy, especially since Queensland does it so much. It's so much better, right? Anyhow, I stop now.
Mm-hmm.
So we do an acid sulfate soil assessment. We go out, we sample in accordance with the sampling methods are not that different between the two guidelines. You come back and you shoot it over to the lab. You get some results back, and the guidance gives you action criteria, which our industry absolutely loves. When there's a number you compare, you get a lab result and you get an action criteria. You compare the two. And if your lab result is greater than that one, you say that and that needs to happen. If it's below, nothing needs to happen. We are so good at this. My God, look at us.
Sorry. Go on.
The critical number, the critical term here is net acidity. So the guidelines gives you 3 action criteria based on soil types. The laboratory reports a net acidity to you, and you compare this net acidity to the action criteria in the guidance. So that's the most basic thing. Net acidity consists of 3 sub-acidities. Tell us a little bit more about those 3 and how we come up with net acidity values.
I think you've got to go back to understand where net acidity actually came from. It's not to do with acid sulfate soils at all, actually. It came from acid sulfate rock. Acid sulfate rock were doing an acid-base accounting, and they've been doing it for years. Well, I don't know how long they've been doing it, but a lot longer than the net acidity in acid sulfate soils. And they used to use a formula which was total sulfur, or maximum potential acidity, which they took as total sulfur, minus the acid neutralizing capacity or the buffering capacity of that material. And that would equal a net acid producing potential, so a NAP it was called. In 1998, it wasn't in the guidelines. And I think it came in around about 2004 that they introduced it into the
Queensland ones.
Queensland, lab guidelines. And they started to think more about it because they believed that what they were doing prior to that wasn't capturing all the different species that you're going to have. And so they thought they were missing something. And they looked at the acid-base accounting for the rock situation. I thought that was too uncomplicated. That was just too easy. So they added things onto it, and they started out with actual acidity and was the other one, potential sulfitic acidity. So they started out with those 2, but then further research started to come up with, well, hang on, those 2 don't capture everything. They don't capture jarosite. They don't capture swertmonite. So then they introduce retained acidity. So they're the three entities that you're talking about. This has come about by research. Anyway, actual acidity is kind of the soluble sulfates that and exchangeable acidity. So actual acidity will be measured with basically by your pH. You get a sample, you mix it up into a liquid, you put potassium chloride with it, and you measure the pH. Now, if the pH is below a certain number, then that has actual acidity in it. It'll do a bit of titration, and you'll get an amount of acidity in that soil, and that will be actual acidity. It's actually there. It may or may not be related to acid sulfate soils. You just know that maybe some of it is related to acid sulfate soils, some of it may be related to aluminium, iron hydrolysis may be related to organic sulfur, but it captures everything. And so
it could just be swampland that is naturally acidic.
Yeah.
I mean, you would catch that when you measure acidity via titrations, or if you remember in high school or early university, you just titrate a certain amount. You count the drops and until you reach pH, whatever your guard target is, I guess 7. So what's the acidity? Actual acidity counts for what acidity is in that soil, and it could be anything.
Yeah, it comes from all sources. You're right. And so to account for jarosite, because jarosite and swertmonite are insoluble, and they do contain some aluminium. So through research, I realized that, actual acidity, when you're just measuring the actual acidity, you're not taking into account the jarosite because it's not soluble.
Okay, jarosite is a byproduct when acid sulfate soil finally, completely has oxidized. It has absolutely taken up all the oxygen it possibly can. It has released almost all the sulfuric acid that it can produce. You end up with swertmonite or with jarosite as a mineral.
Yeah.
And they are insoluble. So you would not catch the acidity that these guys cause in a TAA, in a titration of your soil sample.
Yes, that was the idea behind it, that it wouldn't record. So it needs to be captured some other way. So they came up with a way of capturing it.
So we needed to find a method on, hey, wait a second, actual acidity, so the TAA, the titratable actual acidity, isn't cutting it. There is some more here.
Yes.
That leads us to the second one, to the second subset, which one that's called the potential acidity.
Yep, and that is it's exactly what it says. It's whatever there is potentially more acidity in there that hasn't been accounted for in the other two. So it's potentially there. So the pH might be high. When I say high, around about 6. So you need to account for that potential acidity in the sample as well. So you have an actual acidity that you've measured through a titration. You have a retained acidity that you are measuring because you've seen that there is these byproducts, these jarosite, swertmonite in that sample. So there could be some what they call stored acidity in there. And then you have to determine, is there any potential acidity in there? And that's where the chromium reducible sulfur test is used, because it is almost a direct measure of the amount of sulfitic acidity in the soil, which is...
So these three, you've mentioned the third one already, you slipped that in for me, the retained acidity. You submit a sample to the lab. They give you how acidic is this sample right now. They give you a second number. That's the potential acidity. So if you give this soil sample the right conditions, it will release this much acidity just out of the pyrite. It's not available as yet, but it has the potential to be released. That's why it's called the potential acidity. So we have the actual acidity, we add to it the potential acidity, that if we expose this to oxygen long enough in the right conditions, this material has this and this amount of acidity that it can spew out, and it can be quite substantial, and it is sulfuric acid. So not just a little bit here. We're not talking your average lemon juice here. Okay, we're talking sulfuric acid. And then you mentioned the third one, the retained acidity. That's a third one that needs to be added to the net acidity. talk a little bit about retained acidity.
If you have if your pH goes down below 4.5, there could be some retained acidity in there, which could be coming from your jarosite or your schwertmanite. And so that needs to be accounted for as well. If your pH stays above a certain limit, then you're probably capturing it in the TAA and the potential sulfitic acidity. So you don't need to do retained acidity. You see how complicated it gets?
Tell me about it. Yes. So the retained acidity, I always think of it as like, okay, although schwertmanite and jarosite are supposed to be the finished product of it all, although they have oxidized to the end, they do, however, sit there, and over the next coming months and years, they still have a tendency to release sulfuric acid. So that's why we've developed another method, not only via titration for the TAA, for the actual acidity, via the chromium suite for the potential acidity, but there's a third method that we've developed to come up with, hey, although it pretends to be finished, but it isn't finished, and it has a tendency to release acidity in the future. You add those three up, and you end up with what's called the net acidity.
Yes.
And that's the one you compare to the action criterion in the guidelines, correct?
Yes. Yes, that's right.
So you mentioned before SPOCAS versus chromium suite. What's the difference between those lab methods, like just at a basic level? Like,
SPOCAS is a test method that was originally came about in the 90s. It was considered to be, but it's essentially just adding hydrogen peroxide to a soil. That's basically what you're doing. In Queensland, it's used quite a lot. In New South Wales, we've realised that there are problems with it. And a lot of the problems come about because of the carbonaceous content, the carbon content. Carbon can mask the reaction that you have with hydrogen peroxide in the soil and give you false positives.
Yeah, I get a bit confused when it comes to the calculations.
Really?
It seems to me that there's like an overlap between TAA and TPA. And Gunnar, I don't know if you can help me out here a little bit, because it just confuses me a bit, and maybe I just need to do it more and work through it.
Do we double dip is I think another way of saying it. If you take the TPA, so the chromium reducible sulfur out of the suite, don't you also get some of actual acidity into that result? And by adding them, wouldn't we double dip?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I don't know the answer, but my suspicion is yes, we are. But that's just the suspicion. It's not backed up by any research, science behind it. But my suspicion is, because of the amount of testing I've done now over many, many years, my suspicion is yes, we are. We've added things on. Like I said, we bolted things on, and we haven't really gone back to say, well, hang on, we bolted this on. Are we double dipping? Is the TAA already capturing enough of the retained acidity? Do we need to do 3? I think actual acidity is only useful when you're in a red zone below 2 meters above sea level. That is where it's to benefit. You move outside of that, there's so many interferences with organic sulfur and other forms of acidity that I don't think we can be sure about it.
Different podcast. This is, again, you and I would love to talk to you about the differences here, but let's not. So
it's only my personal opinion. I mean, I've talked about other people and they don't agree. So
let's go back again. Let's not forget where we are. We have a sample and we submit that, and the lab takes these 3 sub-acidities, adds them up for you, and reports them to you. You get a net acidity. Okay, what they also report to you is something called acid neutralizing capacity. What's that all about?
Okay, so just about all soils have some capacity to actually neutralize acids. Now, that might be just their clay structure. Clays have a more of capacity to absorb any acidity that's produced, so that's called a neutralizing capacity. So it's basically a buffering capacity. So calcium carbonate in the form of shells or in form of minerals is a very good buffering agent. And so you can measure that. That can be measured in the laboratory. Sometimes it's significant. If you're on the coast and you're in a beach zone or anything like that around that sort of area in wetlands where there's an influence of the seawater, you can get a lot of buffering capacity. And it could be that there are a lot of shells in that soil. So it can then become part of the net acidity equation because it has a significant buffering capacity. As I go back to what the original acid-base accounting was, it was always included in the acid-base accounting. And up until recently, 2018, that acid neutralizing capacity was included in your net acidity equation. So, but if you had more buffering capacity than you had potential to produce acidity, like net acidity, the idea being that there wouldn't be any acid produced, so therefore you didn't need to do anything about that soil. Now, in 2018, they took A and C out of the net acidity equation.
Takes me back to the beginning. It's in the LEP.
Yeah.
You have to perform an acid sulfate soil assessment in accordance with the 1998 guidelines, which very much have the acid neutralizing capacity in the net acidity calculation.
Yeah, they do.
And in the 2018 guidance, they are basically taken out. Yes, you can still use them under certain circumstances, but ultimately they have been taken out. I come across sites on a regular basis where the difference between the 1998 interpretation and the 2018 interpretation is black and white, because the neutralizing capacity that I'm allowed to use, in fact, I have to use in accordance with the law and with the 1998 guidelines, neutralizes anything that is out there, and then some, because there is the neutralizing capacity, as you said, Laurie, is sometimes huge. Yep. And it totally exceeds, at least in the lab, the capacity of that soil to produce sulfuric acid. If I use the 1998 guidance, which supplements but doesn't replace the 1998, if you use the new guidance, I have acid sulfate soil that needs to be treated. That means I could have a client, they want to build a pool, which is already arguable if you need to do an acid sulfate soil assessment for something that minute. But anyway, that means not only that I had to do an acid sulfate soil assessment, fine, but in accordance with the law, they are fine. They don't need an acid sulfate soil management plan. In accordance with the much, I wouldn't say better, but scientifically more advanced 2018 guidance, they very much need an acid sulfate soil management plan, and they also need someone to implement that. For someone who builds a $50,000 pool, that's another 10 grand you just throw at them just for that. Which guidance do I, as the consultant, use? There is this. It's not even a discussion, and I bring this up to councils all the time when I clear a site. It's like, hey, oh no, you can't do that in the 2018 guidance, and I'm like, well, guys, change your LEP. Right? Please change your, if that's what you want to do, you asking me to perform an assessment in accordance with the 2018 guidance and to make that part of your DA is strictly speaking illegal. Yeah. Because you're asking me to break what's in the law, right? And you know me, how scientifically driven I am, and I know that scientifically the 2018 guidance runs circles around the 1998. Of course it does. We have 25 years of experience. It's just end of Gunnar rant here. It's just one of those things that I cannot get my head around, that we're in a situation like this.
No, neither can I. Okay. And I think anyone who works in it is the same opinion.
Well, last question. So can you please briefly talk about the difference between acidic soils and acid sulfate soils? Because both guidances, the 1998 and the 2018, are extremely clear about the fact that just because you exceed the action criterion with your net acidity does not mean you need an acid sulfate soil management plan. That is, however, something that basically every consultancy skips for whatever conservative reasons or not understanding reasons. Very very few times have I read acid sulfate soil management plans or acid sulfate soil assessments where the evaluation of, hey, I exceeded my action criterion. However, this is still not considered acid sulfate soil. Please talk about this. Maybe we can improve the understanding.
Yeah, okay. An acid sulfate soil, the acidity has come from reduced inorganic sulfur, okay, which is a measure of your retained acidity and your potential sulfitic acidity. In an acid soil, the acidity has not come from reduced inorganic sulfur. It's come from somewhere else. Now, you don't have to determine where that other somewhere else is come from. You don't have to determine that. But you have to determine that it hasn't come from a reduced inorganic sulfur source. That's as easy as I can explain it. So when you get an acid soil, you look at the three entities that we've talked about. You look at total actual acidity, you look at retained acidity, and you look at potential sulfitic acidity. Now, for retained acidity and potential sulfitic acidity, if they don't exist in that soil, then the TAA is not from reduced inorganic sulfur. So therefore, that soil is an acid soil, not an acid sulfate soil. On the converse, if you do have retained acidity and you do have potential acidity, then there is some risk that the TAA could be from reduced inorganic sulfur. Mm-hmm. I'll always advise people to say, all right, look at those two things. Even though you might have a pH in your soil well below 4.5 and 1 before, it's not necessarily an acid sulfate soil. It could be an acid soil. And I would advise people to say the TAA, there's no evidence to suggest that TAA number is coming from reduced inorganic sulfur. It's just a function of the fact that it's got a low pH. Very few consultants are willing to do that.
Very, very few.
Yeah.
Very few.
It's in the guidelines.
It's right there and quite well explained as well. Not obscure. It's very well explained. So somebody says, "Oh, let's just make sure and chuck a couple of tons of lime on it." It's like, yeah, right. First of all, you're spending an awful lot of money. Secondly, the carbon footprint of the lime production alone is already outrageous. And thirdly, as Nadia Toppler from National Guidance fame says so eloquently, she says, lime is not benign.
Yeah.
You can't just go into a wetland, for example, or into any environment that has naturally adopted and adjusted to low pH levels, and you come along and just chuck lime on it and say, "Oh, look at that, guys. How good are we? We are neutralizing this acidic soil, which is perfectly natural, perfectly sitting there, has developed all sorts of biota that love the low pH levels." And we come along and say, no, none of this. We're going to neutralize this.
Yeah.
And this is great. I love this one. It's just one of my greatest rants so far. I promised myself I wouldn't, but yeah.
It's a passionate thing for you, Gunnar. You couldn't help yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
You started talking a little bit about the treatment of acid sulfate soils, Gunnar. Can you just, Laurie, just for anyone who hasn't dealt with this before, can you just spend a couple of minutes just talking us through the sort of the basic principles of treating acid sulfate soils? So, like, what do we use to treat it, and a couple of the methods that are generally used?
Sure. The most available and easiest neutralizing agent is agricultural lime. Agricultural lime in a fine powdered form.
Yep.
You want to be mixing in very, very finely ground stuff that's going to be able to come into contact with as many sand grains and as many soil particles as you can. So the methods that you use, there's a few of them now. They're a lot more sophisticated. The best one is a thing called a pug mill.
Yep.
Pug mill has a hopper and a continuous running belt. So you can mix the soil. The soil goes in. You can actually add a silo with lime going in at a certain rate, so you can match the two. They're very sophisticated now, and it runs along a conveyor belt that gets churned up, both of the soil and the lime at the correct ingredients. and it comes out the other end, and you test it out the other end. That's the most efficient way of doing it. From there, you come down to less efficient ways of doing it. There are things called alu buckets, and an alu bucket will be you'll probably dump a little bit. I'm not sure whether they actually. I think they mix the lime up before. I can't recall now, but the lime in the soil will go in, and it just turns over, and it comes out the bottom.
Right.
It comes in the top, gets churned up, eaten up, spits out the bottom. Well, the problem with all of the neutralization techniques, I'll go through a few others, but the problem with them is heavy clays and stiff clays are very difficult to break up. And if you can't break them up, you can't get the lime in.
Yep.
If you can't get the lime in, you can't get the neutralization. So there is a restriction on that. There is another method that the guys are using down in Shell Cove. It's actually a lime stabilizer, but it's a big machine. It costs about $1 million. It's a huge knife. And it's a road stabilization machine. They've converted it into a acid sulfate soil neutralization machine, but normally you're working on roads.
Right.
You spread the lime out on top of the 300 mil layer, and it goes it all up, just runs over, mixes it all up. That's also very efficient, but very expensive. It won't break up heavy clays, and rocks will break up all the paddles. The most inefficient way is to just mix it up with an excavator and the
which seems to be more often than not the method that is employed, especially on construction sites.
Yeah, it is a cheaper method, but now that we're running on these site-specific resource recovery orders, it won't cut the mustard. You can't validate because it's not effectively mixing. And if you're just mixing it on site and you want to reuse it on site, you might get away with it that way. But if you want to mix it on site and then reuse it on another site, you probably won't be efficient enough.
So that's a really nice segue you've just given us there to my last question I had here, which is about the reuse of treated acid sulfate soils.
Yep.
And so you mentioned their site-specific resource recovery orders. So at the moment, the reuse of treated acid sulfate soils is dealt with on a case-by-case basis.
Yep.
With specific resource recovery orders. Are you able to just talk through some of your experience with that? Because the reuse of treated acid sulfate soil is prohibited unless you have one of these specific orders in place. I guess, is there any scientific reason why you can't reuse acid sulfate soils? And then secondly, what are some of the controls and the experience you've had with these RROs?
There's no scientific reason. It's a physical, technical reason.
Right.
You can't effectively mix the soil in with the lime to be effectively neutralizing over a long period of time.
Yeah.
If you can do that, there's no scientific reason why these soils aren't an effective resource. The EPA are in the process of doing a general resource recovery order so that we don't have a site-specific one.
That's great.
That's coming. Now, it'll take a while because the first thing they asked us when we were sitting around to do things was, what are the issues with acid sulfate soils? Well, we dumped on them. And now I think they realised how many issues there were. And so, but that's coming. And I take my hat off to them. At least they're now consulting and they're doing the right thing and trying to get a solution for the industry, which is great. My experience with them is it all comes down to the type of material you're using and the methodology you're using. The way the actual resource recovery orders are written is a little bit difficult to follow at the moment. They're too complicated. They're too many sub-clauses and that sort of thing. We've talked to the EPA about that. I think we can refine that. But really it just comes down to, do you have the proper methodology in place so that someone like myself, an independent person, can come along and verify and validate that that's been done in accordance with the order. The ones I've worked on, particularly if you're in sands, they're very simple. It's a very simple process. It's not a problem. Once you get into more and more clay content, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do.
Yeah, great.
Laurie, thank you. We've gone way over time. But look, I want to thank you not only for taking the time today, but also you have come out of your shell a little bit lately and you start making use of your incredible experience and your incredible knowledge, and you come out and put your weight behind some changes that need to happen. And I wanted to thank you for that because not a lot of people are willing to do that.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I realised we're going through this resource recovery issue, and just the things that have come about on the EPA website that something needed to be done. And it was very few people have got the experience that I have and been around as long as I have. So, yeah, I appreciate that. I really do appreciate those words. Thanks, Gunnar. And James. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure, Laurie. Thanks so much for your time today as well.
That's all right. No problem.